Good morning. My name is Richard Cowley. Welcome to our webinar. This is to talk about the EOT hybrid model, where some of the shares are owned by employees as well as the trust. Just before I start, just quick introduce my colleague John Besant, who will be joining me for the presentation.
Good morning, a very warm welcome for me. I'm John Besant. I work alongside Richard delivering EOT transactions for our clients. I've worked on more than 50 transactions over the last 3 years, but I've been lucky enough to be with RM2. It is particularly pleasing to have such a good turnout this morning, so thank you for joining us. It clearly demonstrates the thirst for knowledge around hybrid EOT as the EOT market in general continues to develop strongly.
Right, just a little bit of housekeeping for you. So we're hoping to stick to 30 minutes. We are probably not going to have time to sort of take questions live, but please, if you do have questions, there is a sort of facility on the app in order to ask those questions. We will take them on and we will answer them in writing within the next few days. If you need to sort of mark them as if they're very confidential, what we're going to do is we'll take everybody's questions and then we'll just give blanket answers and we'll send them out to everyone who has attended. If any of your questions are confidential, please mark them as confidential, and obviously we won't add those to the list. Also, we are very open and we'll be delighted to ask any questions that you might have if you want to have a further discussion in anything that is related to share schemes or the hybrid model or EOTs in general. We pride ourselves on sort of giving very detailed answers to questions before engagement. If for any reason you have to leave the webinar early, we will be recording this. It will be on our website and it's also via our YouTube channel. And also, if you would like to receive copies of the presentation, please either email me or John and we'll be happy to send them over after we've finished. So we're going to go straight into the presentation and we're going to start off with John speaking. So over to you, John.
So thanks, Richard. I'm going to give an overview of the hybrid model before Richard goes into some of the practicalities associated with such a hybrid scheme. Now, this presentation does assume a base level of knowledge around EOTs in general and how an EOT is structured. We have done other presentations on that you can find in our library on the website. And again, we'd be more than happy to talk with you directly about those. But this presentation assumes a starting point of a good level of knowledge around EOTs. So what they call a pure model is simply an EOT that 100% owned by the trust. A hybrid model, therefore, is where the trust owns more than 50% of the shares of the company, which it must. That's one of the golden rules. The trust must always own more than 50% of the shares. But that does mean that up to 49%, say, to keep the math simple, up to 49% of the shares in a company can be owned directly by colleagues. So at the extreme, the EOT would maybe own 51% of the company shares, and direct shareholding owned by colleagues would be 49%. Now, the colleague stake is usually bought after the EOT transaction, and as we'll go on to see, this can be very attractively priced due to the initial years of the EOT repaying vendor debt to the founders or sellers. We'll definitely come on to that in a bit because that's one of the key areas of this scheme. So how is a hybrid structure set up? Well, let's start with the starting point of usually most sellers into an EOT will sell 100%. Some that don't, and that's a very technical debate in itself, which we won't go into now. But let's say for simplicity that the initial shares are sold to the EOT. So on day one, the EOT owns 100% of the shares. So then key colleagues are granted share options, which are usually using a revenue authorised scheme, for example, the EMI scheme. Now, there are some very detailed rules about qualifying criteria for EMI schemes, and we definitely don't have time to go into those today. But as Richard said, we're more than happy to discuss those with you offline. If an EMI scheme can't be used, then there are other alternatives, such as the CSOP, the company share option scheme. So colleagues therefore are granted an option pretty much soon after the EOT transaction, and they can then later exercise their options. Typically, the exercise of the options when they convert the promise into actual shares is once the vendor debt is repaid. That tends to focus all parties on clearing the vendor debt as quickly as possible so that the business reaches profit share and all colleagues can reap the rewards of employee ownership. I often see EOTs as a game of two halves in football parlance. The first half is mainly about vendor debt repayment, so it's not very exciting for the colleagues, which is again one of the reasons why a hybrid scheme can help retain colleagues through that period. But the second half, once the business is in profit share, is the really rewarding point from everyone's perspective, because that's when all the colleagues can reap the rewards of employee ownership and see rewards in their back pockets. So the shares purchased are generally newly created by the company, which dilutes the EOT shareholding. So in a very simple example, if 100% of the business is sold to an EOT, being 100 shares, then up to 99 shares, new shares, can be issued by the company to dilute the EOT shareholding. But bear in mind, it can never be more than 51.49. So I've got a couple of worked examples. This is a typical example of a company sold to an EOT for £4 million, and it's expected to grow in profitability over the ensuing years as colleagues are increasingly engaged after the EOT is established. So there is something around under or over 5%, which we will go into in a bit more detail with Richard. But suffice to say that anyone owning more than 5%, even in share options, would not be a beneficiary of the EOT. All that means is if the shares are ever sold in the future, that colleague wouldn't get a benefit through the shares sold by the EOT. So in many examples, our clients will want to keep their colleagues, even in an EMI scheme, under 4%. So at the bottom, we've got 4% dilution. At the top of the worked example, we've got 10%. So soon after the EOT is established, you will establish the EMI scheme, typically in, say, the 3 months after the EOT. And that's the key point, because the revenue agreed the strike price of the options at that point. The company then goes through a period of repaying its debt and potentially interest to the vendors of the EOT. And then when it's repaid all its debt, the holders are able to exercise their EMI options. They then stay with the company as a senior employee, and they get the benefit of dividends directly on their shareholding, as well as a profit share out of the EOT shareholding. Then ultimately, when they're a good leaver, and that's very important, there are rules about good leavers and bad leavers, which Richard mentioned. When they're a good leaver, they will typically have the option of selling their shares back to the company and achieving a capital gain. In a normal EOT situation, leavers do not receive a capital gain. It's all about profit share. So this is where the hybrid scheme really comes into its own. Just graphically, very briefly, the same company sold for 4 million. So you can see that the blue line is the debt which gets repaid over about 6 years, which is typical for an EOT transaction. Now, the red line, which is the business valuation, importantly starts off at around about £1 million, because immediately after the EOT, the company owes debt to repay the founders, so the valuation can be typically lower than the price it was sold to the EOT, and that gives you the differential to really make this a very attractive scheme. So as the 6-7 years of debt repayment go by, the value of the business increases. The value of the business will increase automatically to £4 million once it's repaid its debt, but in this example, it increases to about £8 million because it's growing during that 6-7 years. And then ultimately, when the colleague gets to repay their when the colleague gets to sell their shares back to the company on being a good leaver in, say, March 38, March 39, this is a very long-term scheme, they may be able to benefit from a company that's worth £12 million at that time in this example.
Okay, so back to me. Right, so now we're just going to talk about sort of some of those practicalities, some of the reasons why, I've got to mention, RM2 is employee owned ourselves. We have been advising on EOT transactions for over 10 years, pretty much as soon as they became, they were put into legislation. The business itself has been running for over 25 years, and before EOTs we did share schemes. So we are very specialist. We do employee ownership and only employee ownership. So we just want to sort of delve into, you know, okay, so that's sort of how these hybrid model is set up. So why actually do companies use hybrid models? I can tell you we've done a lot of EOT transactions, and the majority, and a good majority of the business that we advise, choose to use a hybrid model. And it's all down to effectively owners who are selling their businesses. By and large, the reality is if the business is being sold to an EOT, it is probably because the owners are considering exit the business or retirement, or at least some of the owners. Now, all businesses, whether they're employee owned or otherwise, are generally run by, or generally driven forward by, a fairly small number of key staff. Now, the pure EOT model is designed to reward colleagues and all colleagues via profit share, which is a good thing. However, if you have ambitious key staff within the business who understand their own value, they may not be particularly motivated by the sort of thought that actually the business is being sold to a trust and therefore they're sharing the business right now. These are the kind of people who potentially were sort of looking at their owners and sort of thinking actually there may be a retirement and there may be an opportunity for me to buy into the whole business. As a result, the EOT model may not quite hit their sort of their requirements for their future careers, and therefore they may need something extra. The share scheme can give them that extra bit of incentive and motivation in order to drive the business forward. These are the next generation of directors of the business. This next slide is really kind of, we're sort of going right the way down to sort of what this actually means to colleagues who actually are lucky enough to be recipients of share schemes. I mean, we view this as, you know, and actually I should mention that me and John, we kind of came to advisory quite late on. I have had a career working in business, and I've been offered myself share schemes from time to time, and this is my opinion because this is what I felt about the share schemes that I was offered. Now, you go to work, you are offered a salary, and you potentially have a bonus written into a contract. It's something that you kind of don't exactly take it for granted, but actually you expect it to have. A share scheme, if it's offered to you, can be something completely extra and not expected by a colleague. It really gives a tangible recognition to that colleague that they are absolutely key in the business and their contribution is absolutely valued. We're also talking about, we're not talking about, a 10,000, 20,000, 50,000 pound bonus. We are talking about the potential of offering particular individuals really life-saving, life-changing values in terms of equity. So we generally equity which is offered after EOTs. I mean, you can go up to an individual getting 49%. That would be spectacularly unusual. But it's not unusual to sort of people getting 10% of equity or being promised 10% of equity via the options that they receive. If you've got a £10 million business, basically those are shares which are worth potentially £1 million. This is life-changing type of things. These are really incentivizing and motivating offers. And really wanting to sort of emphasize also, these guys who basically, they understand the contribution they're making, they understand the value of the contribution they're making, and they know that it can go over to a competitor in order to equally make that contribution. But it's very few competitors would be offering them anywhere near the level of equity that could be offered by a share scheme post EOT. It potentially, I mean, this is a slightly debatable comment, but it potentially addresses some of the weaknesses that are in the EOT model. EOT model is all designed around profit share. As John said, if you leave the business, if it's a pure EOT model, you leave with nothing because you didn't own any shares. If you own your shares, you have the potential of selling those businesses. Not just about you having potential of shares if the business is sold to someone else. Even if the business continues as it was, if you leave the business, obviously terms and conditions will be attached. You can sell those shares back to the company and therefore have, you know, a nest egg for your retirement. Just to sort of emphasize, you know, it gives the shareholders, the people who are recipients of share scheme, it gives them real sort of skin in the game. It goes beyond just sort of short term, okay, I'm going to get potentially a profit share at the end of the year. And this fits into the last point, actually. It potentially allows them to sort of start thinking longer term. It's like the actual owner who's leaving the business, who set up the business and says, I'm going to grow this further. If you're kind of just focused on short-term profit share, you may not think of sort of the more long-term strategy in order to drive in the business. If you have shares, you're more likely, we think, to start that business development. So spend some of the profits on driving the business forward in order to get that capital growth. It helps, basically, when you own your shares, it allows the shareholders to enjoy capital growth. You can get that via the EOT model, but the EOT model will have to sell the business in entirety to everyone else, and that is not a very tax efficient transaction, because the recipients of that, the beneficiaries, are going to have to pay income tax on what they receive. Also, we kind of think that you know, if you're working in an employee-owned business and you're going to profit share, now profit share is basically should be devised. You know, the level of bonuses for people should be sort of decided by the board of the business. However, the board of the business will be under a certain amount of pressure to be basically sharing the profits over everyone. Having shares kind of gives the board an excuse in order to take an enhanced profit share. So say 30% of the equity is owned by individuals and the business has just earned £1 million, which can be distributed. It's not needed for business development. So the logic in my head is that 300,000 would then be paid as dividend to colleagues, and then 700,000 would be used as profit share for bonuses across the business, of which the individuals who own the shares will also take their shares because they are also employees of the business. So this is more sort of focused on sort of the owners of the business. So why, you know, when you're setting up an employee-owned business, why would you advantage some over others? So as I said, when you're doing an EOT transaction, by and large, our experiences, in fact, I think out of the sort of 110, 120 companies that we've taken through EOT transactions, I think there was only one which was done where the owners weren't considering an exit. It as an exit, partly as an exit strategy. When you're going through this, succession planning is super, super important, because obviously usually the dominant leader within the business is moving on, and you need to bring your colleagues up to the next level, and you absolutely do not want your colleagues to leave the business, especially as you're dependent on the business continuing to work in a profitable way and generate, in order to generate the payments back on the back of the EOT transaction. The share scheme helps you with your succession planning, because it is kind of handcuffing your key individuals to the business, because they are so incentivized to stay. On top of that, the second point, so I just had a drink of water. On top of that, there is this other aspect, is it allows some owners, if you've got key colleagues, another one of the downsides of EOT transactions, there's always this period of time where the owners are being paid, and therefore if there is profit share, it's going to be quite limited, because profits have to be used to pay off owners. If you've got someone in the business who's also approaching retirement, but has been a key force in actually building that business, potentially you put them onto the share scheme in order to give them that reward for what they have done in helping you build that business. And a really key thing, just recently, and this is a study which was funded part by RM2, part by the EOA, the Employee Ownership Association, and partly by other companies as well. It was looking at sort of what was happening to companies after they'd done their sort of, after they'd become employee ownership. One of the really interesting things we found from that study is that they actually, in general, found that those businesses that had done an EOT transaction recently and set up a share scheme, they were actually doing better than businesses that were just using the pure EO model. Of course, we've given all the upsides of doing this. Are there any downsides? There are. Generally speaking, they can be managed. I mean, this is, again, the first point is quite debatable. We don't really recognise this. It says, you know, people do comment on basically if you're sort of benefiting certain individuals over others, then it's not really in the spirit of employee ownership. You know, what is right for a business, whether it's employee owned or not, is that it is successful. In order to be successful, those people at the top of the business need to be incentivized, motivated in order to stay with the business and get the business going. Doing an employee owned transaction is not some kind of socialist move or setting up a cooperative. It is a commercial business, and you need the right people at the top to drive that business forward. The share scheme potentially gives you another tool in order to sort of, as I've said, handcuff your key staff to the business in order that they can take that business forward to the next level, and therefore everybody will benefit from it. The second one is fairly clear. If you're basically sort of passing on or offering, granting options to key staff, there will be a point that you'll cut off. It is something to manage that those people who are not getting options may feel somewhat devalued. It's just a fact of life. It's like, you know, the person who was passed over for promotion. You kind of just need to manage those situations. This is a problematic one. So you give your options, you've basically got a legal commitment and to allow people to buy those shares. And your key individuals now may not be your key individuals in the future, or even those people who get equity and therefore expect dividends may not be those key, may not be the people who are driving forward in the future, or may somewhat take their foot off the gas when they get their equity. It's an age-old problem. Obviously, that's another sort of thing which needs to be kind of managed and watched for. Practicalities, I mean, this is when it's successful. If your share scheme has been successful, people have taken their equity, the business has developed and grown and is nicely profitable. However, if you get a number of people who sort of own equity, say around 20% of the equity, all sort of leave within a short period of time, they are good leavers. They sell their business, their shares back to a company, and suddenly the company's got £2 million to pay out, which it potentially could do, but it may obviously affect the ability to profit share. This can be managed. Share schemes are very, very flexible things, and terms and conditions should be incorporated in this. The good leaver, classic good leaver, bad leaver conditions should be put in. You also will commit your colleagues to accepting a deferred payment of the profit in order to allow the deferred payment for the sale of the shares in order to allow the business to keep going with their profit share. You know, there will be a strain on cash, and these kind of things need to be managed. It's the same with, you know, when you've got leavers, when you've got owners leaving business who are trying to sell their business back to their fellow owners. It can be exactly the same situation. And kind of the business should be used to it because it's similar to the situation when the whole business was sold to the EOT in the first place. So practical considerations. Okay. We think the hybrid model is great. Not all our clients take up on it. It is not right for everybody, particularly very small companies. If you've got a company with less than 10 employees, it sometimes doesn't work in terms of actually offering, one or two of the individuals equity. And sometimes, we've had businesses where it's actually the senior colleagues who are offered share schemes said, no, that's not the way we want to work. That's okay. All businesses are different. It doesn't work for everybody. John mentioned it. It's really important. If you offer options, just options of more than 5% of the company's equity, the individuals who are offered those options are not going to be beneficiaries of the trust. It's something to explain to those individuals. It means that if the business is ever sold, they will not get any payment out from the trust because obviously they're not beneficiaries. It doesn't mean that they are not entitled to profit sharing the same as everyone else. That's down to employees. I can tell you, because the shares, if the business is sold, because the shares which are being sold out of the trust are so heavily taxed, it won't take you very much to get above 5% in order to compensate those individuals, because shares held by individuals are far more valuable. That will still be the case whatever they do to capital gains tax after the budget, unless they go completely crazy and put it sort of like a 50% rate, which is incredibly unlikely. It just needs to be managed, or you just keep the percentage below 5%. Terms and conditions apply. I already mentioned that share schemes are very flexible. You can put all sorts of performance measures into when the options can be exercised, and you absolutely will need good leaver, bad leaver conditions. You don't want your key staff to get their shares and then promptly leave the business to join a competitor and sell their shares back to the business and get some kind of reward for it. If they do that, they are a bad leaver. They will be lucky to get what they paid for the shares in the first place. Just the next point, this is a key consideration. Whenever we talk to people about doing EOT transactions, we say, look, don't just think about getting to the end of the transactions. You really should be kind of considering, when you're talking about doing an EOT, when you're building your structure in terms of your EOT transaction and transition, you should be thinking at least 5 years ahead, preferably 10 years ahead. It's the same if you're going to do a share scheme. You should be thinking about the share scheme at the same time as you're thinking about the EOT, if you can. So this is kind of really being kind of firmly safe and trying to identify those individuals who are going to be the key guys who be the next generation of directors. It is useful to structure your EOT transaction in a way that it accommodates the share scheme. It makes your share scheme better and your EOT's transaction and transition better. Just at one point, is not all businesses are eligible to do EMI. Certain businesses in certain sectors aren't allowed to do them. And if your business is over a certain size, you are restricted in the way that you can use an EMI scheme. Other share schemes exist. John mentioned the CSOP. There's also, you can just go straight to an unauthorized share scheme, i.e. one which is not via a sanctioned HMRC scheme. It is possible to do any of those things. I just want to sort of emphasize, so if you've got a £10 million business and you're offering shares to individuals via share scheme, those shares will be valued. Potentially those shares will be very expensive. However, there's a quirk to an EOT transaction, is that they are always, or vast majority of the time, unless they're sold at a very significant discount, they are funded by debt. It may be vendor debt, but it is still debt. So vendor debt, where the owners are lending the money to the trust to buy the shares. It means after the transaction, immediately after the transaction, your business, which maybe was worth say £10 million, it's now got £10 million of debt to pay via the trust to the owners. Somebody does a valuation of your business post-transaction, they're going to say, well, that business was worth £10 million, but now it's got £10 million worth of debt to pay. It's not worth a great deal. So our way that we kind of advise our clients is it's not going to be worth nothing at all, which logic, sort of the maths says it isn't. You're never going to be able to persuade HMRC that a business is worth nothing, which has been trading profitably for the long term. So expectations is that your business is probably worth 10 or 20% of its value before the transaction. That sounds very negative. It is not. It's a paper valuation. But what it does do, it gives you an opportunity to set up a share scheme at a very low value, a very low exercise price for your colleagues. They can buy their shares very cheaply. And even then, they don't actually, when they exercise the shares, they do need to pay for those shares, otherwise it's benefit in kind. So what you do is they exercise those shares, they buy the shares from the company, but the company lends them the money, but then immediately pays them a dividend. You do need distributable reserves to do this, but it pays you a dividend of exactly what they just paid. It gives them a tax liability, but already it has reduced the amount they actually have to pay, and it kicks it down into the January after the tax year in which the dividend was paid. By that point, hopefully they receive more dividends, and therefore they will have the funds to pay it. It's just reducing the valuation more and more. Last point is you really don't want a minority interest discount to be added to those shares. And that's because if you buy with a minority interest discount and you sell your shares back to the company, there's not a third-party sale. Remember, it is easier to reward people if they own their shares. They get nothing if they leave the business if it's just pure EOT. You want to sell them at this, if they're a good leaver at a market rate. Well, HMRC would say, listen, you bought those shares at say a 70% discount, well, you got to sell them at 70% discount. So if you're paying them full value, suddenly 70% of what they're receiving is going to be charged income tax, and national insurance will be attached it. They are not going to get anywhere near what they would have got if they had bought them at full value. Moving on. So these are the closing comments. We haven't really got time for questions as I predicted. Sorry about that. But just want to sort of leave you this last sort of comment. A share scheme attached to an EOT transaction, we think it enhances key staff, the next generation of directors' ability to be aligned with the vendors. We haven't mentioned actually that one of the issues with talking about an EOT transaction, so people sell their business, they sort of make an announcement to their colleagues, and they say the business has been sold to you guys for the future. And then they say, but actually you have to pay us first. It'd probably take you about 5 years to pay you. And it kind of put a bit of a dampener on, obviously they wouldn't say it like that, but it puts a bit of a dampener on the message and saying, well, actually, I'm not really quite sure why you're telling us this, because actually we're not going to see any benefits for more than 5 years, and I can't really see that far ahead in terms of my timescale. Doing a share scheme basically gives your key staff that extra bit of motivation in order to say, look, I'm prepared to stay here for the next 5 years in order to get through the point that I'm going to be paying off the vendors. It gets them completely in line with the vendors. The vendors want them to stay there, they want to be paid, but they actually do want to then pass the business over to their colleagues and their colleagues to benefit from it. And it is better that the guys who are going to be the next generation of directors are still there in order to benefit also from that, it going to profit share and being debt-free from the vendors. Just to let you know what we have just spoken to you about in terms of the value of the business reducing on the back of an EOT transaction. This is something which is debated by some parties, in particular HMRC, who seem to be living in a slightly different reality from the rest of us, who argue that an EOT transaction does not diminish the value of a business. If you get a non-specialist share scheme provider who doesn't specialize in EOT transactions, they will basically be pushed back from HMRC saying, no, the valuation hasn't gone down. They will give you a very standard product, and they will reduce the value by minority interest discounts, giving the problem that we've just mentioned. Doing a proper post-EOT share scheme is a very specialist product. It can only be done by people. You have to approach HMRC in a particular way, and you have to change the transaction, the EOT transaction, and subsequent structure of the business in a particular way in order to be able to persuade HMRC that the value has gone down. An off-the-shelf product, share scheme product, will not be as good as one product that specialist advisors can give. To be honest, RM2, as far as we are aware, are the only people who do share schemes post EOT in the way that we think is the right way, i.e. reducing the value not by minority interest discount, but by the fact that there is debt associated with the business in order to make those shares affordable. And it's just to re-emphasize, as we would do in terms of any EOT transaction, you're not just thinking, you really shouldn't just be focused on the end of the transaction. It is not just a legal exercise. There is an awful lot more going on within your business. And part of your succession planning, if you're going to do a share scheme, is the actual creation of that share scheme and the structure of that share scheme. It is so much better if you're thinking about that while you're designing your transaction. Okay, so I hope that has been interesting for you. I hope that has been informative. We haven't really got time for any questions, but please send us your questions in terms of the actual webinar. We will answer them in writing. We'll send them out to whoever. If they're confidential, please tell us. Thank you very, very much for joining us. If you would like to talk about whether it's share schemes, hybrid models, or EOT transactions themselves, please get in touch. We are very open to discussions before you engage us. You will find that our knowledge is deep and has a wide breadth because we are so specialist. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for joining us and have a great afternoon.
Goodbye.